With everything sketched in, the composition is complete. Now I can focus on adding details to each part of the landscape before I move on to outlining and coloring it in. Because the large tree is in the foreground, it's the closest and it's the largest, so it's going to be the most detailed thing in the landscape. I'm creating this jagged shape to represent the leaves in the tree, and I'll use different shades of green when I color it to make it look more realistic. So as I color, I'm conscious of how I'm using the marker to create more realistic textures and shading. I think about the brush strokes so that the trees look bumpier and more random, but things like the lake look smoother because all of the lines are going in the same direction. Because landscapes are often large areas of one color, it's important to try to work in different shades of the same color. So you can see that I have a few different types of green, a few different types of blue to give me a variety of colors, even though there isn't actually a variety of colors in the landscape. I color areas more than once to make them darker, to create shadows. I may also go over colors with other colors to make them look more like shadows as well. So everything in our landscape is blocked in, but because there's so much detail in a landscape, even though usually coloring is the last step, I feel it's necessary to go back and try to add more detail into these large spaces. Because I used multiple layers of color on the marker, it tends to make the marker bleed a little bit. So if I come back to add the outlines again, it helps to make them clear rather than having the edges all bleeding together. So these leaves, even though I'm still not going to draw every single leaf, I use a variety of different kinds of marks to imply the textures that I see in nature. And one of those is this jagged, random, scribbly line when I'm drawing the leaves in trees. I start off by drawing the basic shape of all the leaves, and then using different shades of the same color, and as you can see, sometimes black as well, I can go back in and just create the impression of all of those leaves in those big bunches. More detail will make something look more realistic. That's not the same thing as having more things in the picture. I have a pretty limited number of things in my picture. I don't have much in the foreground. The middle ground is basically one object and a few objects in the background. It's not about quantity. But when it comes to details, the more details you add, the more realistic it is going to look. Every detail adds a little bit more to look at in that object. So if you had to choose, I would choose less objects with more detail rather than more objects with less time to add as much detail. I want to try to imply some of the texture of these plants that are in the water. But again, I don't want to draw them all because it looks like there are thousands of them. But this is different than the texture that's in the trees. They look like lots of individual little round leaves floating on top of the water. So I'm going to create some lines and loops to represent those. But I also want to imply that they're on the surface of the water, so I'm using lines that are more horizontal. And as I move into the background, you can see that the loops become smaller and then they just disappear. And they become these dots and lines. And this is just a general gray color, so I can actually add it to any color I want, and it makes that color a little bit darker. So I also use it in the tree to put shadows. See the shadow from these leaves being cast onto the trunk of the tree. I can add a shadow there. I can add a shadow there. And then that just makes it look a little bit more realistic. I think these are darker because they're underneath the tree, so they're not going to be getting hit by the sun. All right, so here's our landscape. We have a tree in the foreground with some grass. We have a pond in the middle ground, which has all of this plant material floating on the top. And then we have more trees in the background, so they're smaller because they're farther away. So I hope you like the way that your landscape turned out, and I will see you next time. Bye.